Now, the last announcement. Today's speaker is Tanya Merchant, who's an associate professor of music and feminist studies at UC Santa Cruz. Tanya is an ethnomusicologist, and her research interests include the musical intersection with issues of nationalism, gender, identity, and the post-colonial situation. She has a geographical focus on Central Asia and the former Soviet Union. She's done field work in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Russia. She's an avid performer on both the Uzbek dutar and the Baroque bassoon, and she's given concerts with ensembles in the US, England, and Uzbekistan. The title of today's talk is Community Resilience, Spontaneity, and Adaptability in North American Contra Dance Groups. So, how do we wake this up? You know how? Great. Yeah.
Come on, it thinks it's going. Who knows the projector? Think the project, because my computer thinks it's awake. Thank you all, and this is a very good reminder that I need to update my bio on the faculty website, because my second research area is North American social dancing that I've been developing since tenure. And I am also a dance scholar here locally in the campus. So we're going to hear about my latest research project about resilience and spontaneity and adaptability and cultural sustainability, really, in North American contra dance groups. So let's get started. What's a contra dance? Contra dance is social and participatory dances in long wave sets, meaning long lines of couples. And the participatory is really important. It is not something that is enjoyable to watch. It is not put on stage. If people show up and want to sit on the side, they're often sort of dragged into the dance, hopefully willingly. Consent is also very important in this community. But you really learn by doing in this thing, and virtuosity means something different. It's not something that's terribly fun to watch, although we're going to watch some. And there's a choreographic sequence that is taught and prompted by a dance scholar, and it has to be accompanied by live music, right? This is so important. We'll get later in my talk, we'll talk a little bit about how they adapted through the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was so important that they solved latency so that they could dance to live music over Zoom. This is how vital live music is to this practice. The choreographic dance sequences are organized into 4 16-beat phrases, and dance partners progress to new neighbors as this 64-beat sequence repeats. Dance events vary in size, length, and experience level, but for the purposes of this project, we're sort of looking at 2 main categories of events: regular local dances, which usually last 2.5 to 3 hours, and occur weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, and usually have about 10 to 13 dance sequences and a break in the middle, because it's aerobic. Then we also have special dances, which occur over weekends or week-long dance camps that sometimes allow for as much as 12 hours of dancing per day. And my kid and I went to one 2 weeks ago, and I can say, you can actually dance for 11 or 12 hours a day if you're so inclined. You can also sit and do other things, but yeah, there we go. One of the important things about this practice is that it's volunteer run, right? This is a grassroots phenomenon that is throughout the continent. Volunteers organize these dances, book halls, sit at the door and take money, mark down who's there. There's a semi-professional aspect to it that the dance scholars, the musicians, and the sound techs are all compensated. And that sort of, we can think of, if we think of like amateur or sort of non-professional and professional at the ends, really semi-professional is a big gray area. So that toward the end, you really have professional musicians who and dance scholars who make their living from this, among other things. As we understand, sort of creatively oriented folks tend to have make livings from a bunch of different things, and dance calling or playing for these dance bands can be a piece of a larger sort of career, shall we say. There are local and national nonprofit organizations that are sort of the institutional framework. The national or the international one that covers primarily North America and some stretch into the UK is the Country Dance and Song Society. But there are local organizations here. There's one in Monterey, and there's the Bay Area Country Dance and Song Society, which covers dances throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. I called one for that society yesterday in San Francisco in the Mission District. Let's see, so that's the basics. What does it look and sound like? Let's see if we can get this playing. Here's your cycle. Oh, sorry, the controls are a little rough. It's hard to end at the end of a phrase. But there we have it. This is what we're dealing with. Lita, I picked this example just for you because they're using a bombard, which is an oboe instrument used in the revival of Breton music in France. Oh, no, that's not supposed to happen. There we go. Let's talk about history. So contra dance came to North America via British colonization. And it was really the popular, if you think about what we do now to go dancing, oftentimes we talk about going to clubs and sort of solo improvised dance, if you will. This was the equivalent of what popular sort of ordinary social dance was in the 17th and 18th century. It was popular throughout sort of Britain and France, and it came to the US in the 17th and 18th centuries and was really, really popular. It was present in all 13 colonies. And it was sort of a thing to do on a Saturday night, right? Other dance forms, especially the quadrille, which is the predecessor of square dancing, really overtook popularity of what was considered at the time, it was called the British style of these long ways dances. And so really in the late 19th and 20th century, it waned in popularity such that at least the story that there's a lot of sort of oral history, there are sort of community historians. David Millstone is probably the most well-known. He's a dance caller out of New Hampshire. There's a lot of sort of self-preservation of this history. And they talk about the fact that it was just really stubborn rural New Englanders is the story that they like to talk about. And I myself come from stubborn rural New England stock, so I identify with this. But they kept up all these newfangled Frenchy dances that came in, you know, in the 18th century and gained popularity. We don't like that. We'll do the British stuff, right? And there are dance halls in Massachusetts that boast continuous weekly Saturday night dances since the 18th century. Yeah, so lots of stubbornness and also fun. So already questions. Okay, let's go.
How did it develop in Britain?
That's a good question, and I'm not a historian. But essentially, these are just they're country dances. So at the time, there would usually be tunes that go with specific dance choreographies. If you've listened to Lita Miller talk about courtly dances, I don't know if she's made you all do galliards, but I know she makes our undergraduates dance them. This is the sort of non-elite version of those styles of dances. And I'm not sure that we particularly, you can trace specific dance choreographies and where they come from, but as a practice, this is just, you know, this was before the internet and before screens. People get bored. You want to do something. And these are dances that, you know, when they talk about people like working on farms, right? Everyone working on the farm would get together and dance at night if someone plays the fiddle. I actually have a heritage connection to this dance style. My great-great-grandfather, John Kelly, would play the Grange Hall dances in South Pomfret, Vermont, and that's how he earned his way through school. That's how he paid for his schooling. He's from Warren, New Hampshire. He would take the train into South Pomfret. And so this is just how communities entertained themselves before video games and the internet. Yes.
Yeah, so I have a question which I've always wondered about, which is where does the name contra dance come from? Because it doesn't sound anything to me.
No, it doesn't. Very good. This is actually an anglicization of the French word contredanse, which I'm going to mispronounce because I speak Uzbek and Bosnian and Russian and not French. Basically this dance, because this was all the rage, right, for a while, it went over to France, and the French dance masters, which were very popular, they would have broadsheets and things, French dance masters got it, and they called it the contredanse because the lines of facing couples, and so contra meaning against, right, so you're facing, so that's where it comes from. So contredanse then came and became contradance here, and when it came over via British colonization, of course, New England isn't the only place that this went. So there are also versions of contradance which look very different in Haiti and in Cuba, that blended with Afro-Caribbean styles and have a very different body movement to them, which is beyond the scope of my research, but this sort of spread and sort of localization of colonial dance forms, I think it's a really neat phenomenon.
But it's nothing to do with Nicaragua.
Nothing to do with Nicaragua, no, or extreme politics or disappearing anyone. Yes, thankfully, I just get to talk about community sustainability.
One thing I forgot to mention is there will be time for questions after.
Thanks. All right, so we've got the story of the stubborn New Englanders who didn't want to do this new Frenchy square dancing stuff. And it's interesting, you read some of the books out of the mid-20th century when square dancing was all the rage, right? Modern Western square dancing was huge. And Ralph Page, one of the big figures, actually says, you know, here's a book of these contra dances that I've collected. Oh, square dancers, I hope you will try one of these contra dances in your square dances, right? Because it used to just be town hall dances and you dance circles and contras and you sort of dance all things. And now in the 21st century, at least in contra areas, like to do a square dance is a thing that people debate whether it's worth doing a square dance when we're all here to contra dance. And so there are these movements of popularity that I think are kind of fascinating. But it was really the 1970s, the folk revival and the bicentennial sort of coincided to really give contra dance sort of a big kick. And you saw people who were part of the folk festivals then showing up at New England town hall dances, and at least in the community, there are stories of like tie-dye wearing barefoot hippies dancing with the sort of button-up New England farmers in their white button-down shirts and their dungarees, and sort of how they managed that change in the 1970s is one particular story in this subculture or community. And this sort of approach to, okay, you want to come to our dances, okay, has continued, and really, I have found it really fascinating how purposeful and how sort of, yeah, I guess how purposeful and how careful the community is about trying to continue and bring in new generations and really make this a practice that can continue for hundreds of years. And that's sort of what we're going to talk about. There are further changes that I get excited about. The music, of course, has changed, and the choreography has changed over the years, as well as community norms. And we'll dig into some of that, but that's a historical overview for you. Let's talk about musical developments. When we think about the music that started this, right, we have these country dances that have choreographies associated with tunes. So the chorus jig is a famous one, right? And the chorus jig is a tune that you can play, and it's a set of choreography that goes to the tunes. And usually when we're talking about this, we're talking about a melody line. The most common melody instrument would be the fiddle, and some kind of, they call it the rhythm section, but it's really a chordal accompaniment. And I apologize if this is getting a little too specialized for anyone who's not from the music department. But there are a few of you here, so I want to mention this. This idea of sort of a melody and rhythm instrument has continued, and throughout the sort of the modern era, I guess, if you want to say, you got New England fiddle tunes as one of the main repertoires that you dance here. And I want you to pick up that this is in binary form. You've got an A phrase that lasts for 16 beats and it repeats once. And then you have a B phrase and it lasts for 16 beats and then repeats once. And so we're going to listen to one of the most famous dance leaders out of New Hampshire in the 1970s is Dudley Loftman, and he started the Counterbury Country Dance Orchestra, and we're going to hear a recording of one of his tunes, Tara's Reels. So let's give this a listen. Back to the beginning. All right, so we've got AABB, and we've got a bunch of fiddles. This is a large group, actually. This is a community group. Ted Levin, actually, if you know, there is apparently a Central Asian music scholar also does Contra Dance Connection, because the other main scholar who works in Uzbekistan is Theodore Levin. He actually played in Dudley Loftman's Canterbury Country Orchestra. I don't know if he's playing on this recording, but I think that's kind of neat. That there's a lot of us who started working I started working in Uzbekistan and then started working on this. Ted Levin started in Dudley Loftman's Canterbury Country Orchestra and then ended up in Uzbekistan. Anyway, you've got the sort of piano accompaniment going boom, chuck, boom, chuck, boom, chuck, boom, chuck, right? This is really common to this sort of New England fiddle repertoire, fiddle tune repertoire accompaniment. It's sort of, there's a little bit of a staid and predictable factor to it. All right, so throughout the 20th century, this was sort of the standard, and you still hear a lot of this style of playing at local dances, right? Because again, we're talking semi-professional. You probably get 50 or $100 to cover your gas. This is not a way to make a living. This is a way to sort of enjoy social time and have a hobby for a lot of people. So we're not looking at sort of professionalism in the way that you do with professionalized classical music. The other main repertoire that throughout the 20th century was performed for these dances is old time music, and that's especially in the Midwest. So let's listen to Red Prairie Dawn, which is an old time tune by Gary Harrison. This is the Barn Owls performing. It's so hard to get this stopped. I'm sorry that we're not having a smooth transition. All right, so this is sort of the staple of what contra dance music has been until somewhat recently, really since the 21st century. There have been a rise in touring professional bands who play these big special weekends, and they just tour around a bunch of them. And a lot of them are really influenced by jam bands like the Grateful Dead, which we know a lot about in our campus, and Fish, and these kinds of things. And this has really changed what at least the sort of closest on the spectrum of professionalism, right? The more professional side of them tend to be doing more jam sounding stuff. You still have to have this 64 beat. You're still functioning in this binary form of 64 beats and then you cycle because the choreography depends on it. But here's an example of more recent sort of high level on the professionalism spectrum music. This is the faux pas doing Walkmaster. And it, yeah, it was a little different. B. Back to A. These interfaces, they're too clever for their own good sometimes. All right, so you can hear a difference, right? Yes, yeah. But it's still the same cycle. It's still binary form. You can still dance to it, right? And one of the things that's really happened with this format is this idea that there's more flexibility. There's more sort of playfulness for bands who are functioning on this level, but there's still the idea that at your root, you are a dancer, right? And so I wanted to put up one of the women who I have danced to and who is a really sort of very famous fiddler within the scene is Audrey Joubert. And she says, the #1 rule is we're here to serve the dancers. If something doesn't work, move away from that as quickly as possible. You want to create a 7-minute mini drama, a unique experience. No matter how many times we've played this set, I will always try to bring something different. So that gives you a sense of what's fulfilling for the players as well, right? Because they're not doing the same thing over and over again, right? You can't actually just play a recording because the idea is that the musicians as well as the dancers are having a unique experience at each dance. But at its root, it's this collaboration. It's not the musicians are the most important. It's not the dancers are the most important. It's not the caller who's planning the evening is the most important. And so especially within this sort of jam band framework, musicians work very hard to have a sense of development with the different pieces they play. They also work really hard to pick tunes that go with choreography, and we'll be talking about choreography next. So it's really a collaboration beforehand with the caller who picks the choreographies and the musicians to pick something that goes together so that the music tells you what to do. And I hope you could hear how sort of when the phrases change, you can tell the movement's going to change. You're going to go back to doing something else. All right, so. Oh, no, that's not what I want to happen. That's Red Prairie Dawn. Okay. And that's the faux pas. Let's see if we can get to the next slide. There we go. Okay, well done. So this is what a dance card looks like, right? I just called 9 of these last night, right? It's still divided into that binary form, right? You've got two A phrases and two B phrases. And this is really important. They call tunes that don't conform to the 64 beat phrase crooked tunes, right? And you don't want to put a crooked tune in these dances because then the dancers don't know what to do and the caller gets confused. So each of these is a specific choreography. One of the most common ones is the very first one, neighbors balance. So you have your partner and you have a group of neighbors and you balance, you just step forward and step back. It doesn't even matter what foot you step forward with, right? This is the level of complication, right? So you step forward, you step back, you swing, which is we often do in ballroom position. You move in a circle around your neighbor. Circle left 3 places and swing your partner. And then you take the whole set, goes in long lines forward and back. And then the Robin's chain, which just means they pass in the middle by right hands and swoop around with left with their neighbor. And then they put left hands in and they turn a star. And if you have ever square danced in gym class, you might know what a do-si-do is. It means to go back to back. You pass by right and then step to the right and go back into place without touching. And then that's the whole cycle. This one of my research questions is, why is this fun? Because it looks kind of boring on paper, I have to say, right? Like, you do that, it's repetitious, and someone's telling you what to do every, 4 to 8 beats. And like, why is this fun? It really is fun, but I don't know, like, why is it fun? And it's interesting, some of my interlocutors have said it's because you take away the decision fatigue. You trust the band and the caller that you're gonna have a good time. And that way you can let go and feel the music and just experience it. And you don't have to micromanage yourself because you have what you're doing, you know what's happening. You don't have to question it. You don't have to get into all the decision fatigue of modern life, right? You just go with it and you know you're going to have fun. That's what they say. But I also want to be aware that one of the other things that people say about this is, oh, it's so beginner friendly. And compared to, I don't know, ballet lessons, yes, this is beginner friendly. But I do think that sometimes when community members say that it's beginner friendly, they forget what it's like to be a beginner, right? And I also call barn dances, which are designed for rooms full of beginners, but contra dances really don't work if you have a room that's more than 50% beginners. Really 25% beginners is the max you want to be able to do some of the more complicated things, because dancers are expected to learn and know an unofficial glossary of these figures, right? There's a shorthand, and I'm gonna walk everybody through everything, but once the band starts playing and I start cueing, I don't have time to explain things. Really, you learn from other dancers, you take hands. But for the most part, you're expected to kind of know what a do-si-do is and how to swing your partner. All right, so when we think about choreography and how choreography and musicians work together, I want to think about how this can manifest differently depending on context. So next we're going to go into this choreography, which is Simplicity Swing. We're going to watch 2 different videos. First, a local dance example with some old time accompaniment, and then a dance weekend example with some of this jam band accompaniment. And I'd love for you to pay attention to how the dancers' sort of gestures and the way that they interpret the music, even within this very structured framework, changes. So let's start with a local dance example. If I can switch slides. There we go. Okay, here we go. Here it cycles again. All right, so there's our cycle. Before that goes too far out of your brain, same choreography, oh, maybe. Same choreography, different caller, different event. This is now Dance Weekend where you can dance for 12 hours a day if you want to. This is the Great Bear Trio with caller Warren Doyle. Same choreography. All right, we will stop. I know you all want to go download music from the Great Bear Trio. I do. I love it. Anyway, it's the tenor saxophone, or actually, I think that's actually baritone. It's the saxophone player that makes that so compelling. Anyway, so really different feel there and a different level of sort of flourishes and spontaneity, right? Different gestural vocabulary going on. And that's for a number of reasons. I think the music is cueing some of that. It's giving people the freedom to have that individual expression at the same time that you have to do-si-do at just the right time, right? The other thing that's going on is this is a dance weekend. So a lot of these people, if this is maybe a Saturday night on a dance weekend, they've already danced with a number of these people and they have a sense of where their ability levels are and the kinds of things that they might want to do. So there can be some nonverbal consent to things like the blues dance style dips and things that you don't just walk up to someone and like, let's do this, right? That's not okay. You need some kind of agreement, but in a setting like this, you tend to have people who want more advanced dance flourishes and whatnot. And also you probably danced with them at some point, so you know where their comfort level is. We hope. Creeps also happen. So and we'll talk a little bit about that as well, is how do you negotiate what is acceptable for flourishes in these spaces? And there's both verbal and nonverbal negotiations that go on. But as you can see, I guess, let's go to the next slide. Because in addition to, whoops, goodness, PowerPoint. In addition to why is this fun, where and when is the spontaneity is another of my questions that I find interesting, again, because it's so circumscribed, right? And for dancers, it tends to be these flourishes, right? Are you going to twirl at the end? Are you going to put your arm down and say, no, I do not? Right? Are you going to switch dance roles? So, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but historically, these dance forms were divided into gents and ladies parts. We now no longer gender them, at least on the coasts. And we call the left-hand dance role the lark and the right-hand dance role the robin. And if you dance on the right, you're a robin, and then that's just sort of where you are, and you can dance whatever you want. And what that really does is it gives people flexibility to switch in the middle of the choreography. And so that's another way that dancers sort of spontaneous. Sometimes it's spontaneous, sometimes it's a spontaneous mistake. And you find yourself on the other side of the set and you're like, okay, this is fine, I'll just be a robin The other thing that is my 12-year-old kid's favorite is a chaos set, where it's not just switching dance roles. You'll swap partners with people. You'll drag your partner to another line of dancers, and they call it a chaos set. And yeah, my 12-year-old thinks this is amazing. It's really fun until you get beginner dancers who are flustered by it. So it's a sort of community negotiation of how much chaos can you handle? And oftentimes at these dance weekends, they'll designate one set, one of these long lines, because as you see, there's more than one usually going in these big weekends. They'll designate one as the chaos set. So if you want to do that level of spontaneity, go over there. The rest of us can't handle it, that kind of thing. So that's the dancers and their spontaneity. With musicians, clearly it's ornamentation, texture, groove, articulations, and there is some improvisation over that, especially in this more groove-based band. You'll see that they'll take the harmonic structure and have some basic articulation, and they'll throw the tune away for a while and just noodle around. And then eventually one of the A's will come back and they'll come back to the tune. And that moment of unity of, oh yes, I know what we're doing, I recognize this tune, is a really fun moment oftentimes for dancers, for everyone. For callers, spontaneity, there's a lot of pre-planning. Now that I have become a dance caller, I know just how much pre-planning you do for this and how much of a puzzle it becomes about where you add choreographic diversity and how soon can you reintroduce a move and all of these things. It's really, it's a more satisfying puzzle than I ever thought it would be before I started doing this. But also, I believe there's a saying that says no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. I'm not sure who the enemy is in this metaphor, but usually most dance programs don't survive the first few dances through. If people walk in and you have a bunch more beginners, you pull different choreography out that meets the beginners where they are, right? If you realize that after the break, all the beginners went home, you put away all your beginner choreography and you pull out the hard dances that everybody wants to do, right? If you notice that people are tired, right? You do something smoother with less jumping and bouncing, right? Callers actually do a lot of juggling of which choreographies come when based on what they see in the room. And then there's also the teaching and the prompting, right? How I might introduce a specific move might be different depending on who's in the room. And then there's something called hash calling. And that is there are callers who are not me, who know enough about these moves and who have done them for decades, and they don't get a dance card, they don't plan the choreography, they just know in their head how all these puzzle pieces fit together, and they just stand up on the mic and call figures. What's interesting, there's a popular dance caller, Will Mentor, who I interviewed in 2022, who does hash calling along with a number of others. And he said, hash calling is so caller-centric, and contradancing's tradition is not that. Contradance tradition is that the good caller gets out of the dance and lets the dancers have a direct relationship with the music without the intermediary of the caller's voice. And so this sort of speaks to this interlinking of caller, dancer, musicians are all supposed to be working together. No one's supposed to be fully in charge, even the caller who's the MC for the event effectively. And so especially, and Will Mentor is known for this in his calling, is that he stops even prompting as quickly as he thinks the room can handle, so that it's just the dancers and the choreography and the musicians sort of able to have this moment together without listening to his voice. But that can also feel uncertain. Like when we talk about what some of these dancers talk about of, I just know I'm going to have fun and I don't have to think about it too hard. If the caller backs out too quickly, there's that moment of, oh no, now I need to remember choreography. It's not in my body yet. I need to remember, what do I do next? Is it a star? Is it a chain? What do I do? So that can also sort of take away the fun. So callers are really working on this balance of meeting the room and letting them have this pleasant experience of having choreography in their body, but also sort of carrying them through it so that they don't have to think and make decisions and worry about what comes next. All right, let's keep going. So dancing through the COVID-19 pandemic. This I started this research project at the end of 2017, and by early 2020, as you all know, we were given shelter-in-place orders, and we were aware that congregate activities, especially congregate activities that involve breathing on one another, are, you know, super spreader events. And so what amazed me, I thought my new research project was just heading for the toilet. You know, I was just like, oh no, what do I do? I'm gonna have to find something else to do, right? What's gonna happen? No, this community wanted to keep dancing to the extent that within a week of the shelter in place, we had people making callers collectives. This is how I learned how to call contra dances, is I was just a dancer, and one of the dancers actually from the South Bay got together a bunch of people to come talk about calling and learn about calling, starting as early as March 2020. So we all met on Zoom. We didn't actually dance. We just learned how to read the card and do the things. And so I attended those all the way through the pandemic, just learning how to call dances. I didn't learn to call dances on Zoom, but that was a whole other thing. This caller, her name's Claire Takamori. She's a force of nature. This is the other thing I've learned in my research, is that institutions are great, but it really takes one really organized, enthusiastic person, who is usually a woman, to make all of these things happen. And Claire Takamori is one of these forces of nature. She didn't just get these callers collectives, because her read was that as a society, we were going to need to come back to dancing again, that we were going to need these moments of social togetherness. And so she wanted to make sure that we had new callers and new musicians ready to meet that moment when we opened back up. And so this was a very purposeful plan on her part, and it worked. Look, I'm a dance caller. And the other thing that she did was she worked with audio techs, because any of you who have spent time on Zoom know that there's usually a little latency, right? And this is a huge problem. It's not so much of a problem when we're talking. We can sort of, it's within the realm of forgivableness, the amount of pause. But when you're trying to make music together, when you're trying to hit a downbeat together, it's impossible. It's awful, right? It's miserable. And musicians around the world were trying to figure out how to solve this. Our music department was trying to solve this, and we did creative things with video, but we didn't go to the extent that the contra dancers did. I was a little bit sheepish to realize that my contra dancers were creating more sophisticated solutions to make live music together than the music department at UC Santa Cruz. But it's true, and it was this important. Claire Takamori got together with musicians and got together with audio techs. The good thing, the other thing, the piece of this that I didn't mention that was on my bullet points, is that lots of geeks like to contra dance. And part of it may be the geometry of the choreography, but it's also that, again, it's this controlled social interaction where you're going to smile and hold hands with people and have fun, but you don't have to make conversation or make a lot of decisions. It's very geek friendly, right? And so that also means that a lot of the people who founded the contra dances in the 70s here in the Bay Area came out of MIT and Harvard and the contra dances there. And they got hired in Silicon Valley companies, and they brought the contra dancing with them. And so geeks who contra dance is a thing. And luckily, many of them do audio tech work as well as computer programming and all these other things. And so Claire Takamori got together with audio techs and musicians, and they started working on how to do this. And they used a number of software programs, including Source Connect Now and Zoom and one more. And they had a live audio tech mixing the sound from musicians in different places and a caller in a third or fourth place, and live mixed this so that people could dance from their living room. There were callers and choreographers creating choreography to be facing a screen instead of facing a partner. They called them duples. So instead of a group of 4, a group of 2 could dance. You saw people dancing with stuffed animals sometimes as imaginary partners. It was a moment of creativity for this community, and it became very important by May. So if the pandemic started didn't start, but if the shelter in place order started in relatively early March 2020, it was May 2020 that the first online dances started for contra dancing. They got this spooled up very quickly. And throughout 2020, and even today now, there are still online contra dances going on, right? They're much fewer in number, but this is something that still meets a community need. And so you can see this is the Zoom box from a dance that's November 7th, 2020. This is actually a waltz night, which is one of the things that we realized, even though we worked very hard to get choreography that would work to be like contra dance, the truth is it's not like a contra dance to dance in your living room with a stuffed animal in front of the Zoom screen. And a lot of people didn't actually do as much of the choreography, although people did like a chance to get some cardio when we're all sort of in the living room on our couches. But more often you'd see people sort of sitting and listening to the music. And so the North Bay Country Dance Society, so like Marin and Mendocino, got together these waltz nights, realizing that contra dancing, people weren't actually doing a bunch of it. They had waltz nights where they would hire these more professional bands to play waltzes for an hour, and they had basically a tip jar. And this really became a way to support the highest level musicians and callers in the community for whom this did represent a piece of their livelihood that was completely lost. And I'm really proud of this community. And it became, the other exciting thing is it became international, right? I didn't get up to the North Bay to dance very much because that's a really long drive. And I certainly didn't get to Toronto to dance very often, but Toronto had an online contra dance. And so I could go to that a few times, right? The Dance Flurry in upstate New York, in Saratoga Springs, New York, is a huge dance weekend in February during President's Day weekend. Very hard to get to if you teach on the quarter system, yes, from California. But I could go to their online events, right? And this was a way it sort of created a more international community. It connected it connected members of the community who weren't traveling from dance weekend to dance weekend. And the other thing that it did was it really supported the musicians and the callers who were needing this piece of their income. The Country Dance and Song Society also started a main clearinghouse page for Kickstarters, so that all of the bands could put their Kickstarter albums on. And I donated to a bunch of Kickstarters, and callers who, you know, they sort of had a basic needs list going up there to help support the musicians and the callers who were depending on this, who had lost their livelihoods or a piece of their livelihoods. So dancing through the pandemic was actually a really exciting time for this community, as much as it was a scary time socially. We really, I think, contra dance's adaptability throughout the decades was sort of on display there. This was important. The other thing is, this is a hobby. This is what people do on a Saturday night. And it was so important that they solved latency on Zoom and hired audio mixers to live mix things. And people were so dedicated to this that that's what they chose. That, to me, is sort of amazing. And it speaks to how important this practice is to the people who do it. The next step was, how do we come back in person, right? If you remember, summer 2021 was supposed to be this big opening up because we didn't know about Omicron yet, right? Do you remember this? Sometimes it's hard to remember. Like, we thought, so a few dance camps did come back in person, and it was like, wow, this is going to happen. But very quickly, I don't know if it was the Delta wave and then the Omicron, the Delta wave came up, and we realized that it was not yet safe to be in a big congregate hall and do cardio and breathe on one another. Right? And so what happened after that was, how can we do this and how can we do harm reduction, right? And so you see these grassroots organizations start taking surveys of their constituencies. They started talking about mask mandates, vaccine mandates, and they started putting together policies for COVID-19 sort of harm reduction. And so a lot of these dances, you can see, this is the Hayward Contra Dance in the Hill and Valley Club on B Street in Hayward on July 10th, 2022, which was at a time when they had both a vaccine and a mask mandate. So you can see all those folks are dancing in N95 masks, right? And that was actually one of the policies. At first, it was just masks. And then very quickly it became, no, we've seen the research, right? Geeks who dance, right? We've seen the research. We know that N95 or better is what we need to do. So you see these organizations investing in taking some of the door take and using them to buy N95 masks to hand out at the door for people who don't show up, right? And so there we are, dancing in masks. It was sweaty. It was not my favorite dancing ever, but was it worth it to be dancing in person in 2022 and late 2021? Oh yeah, it was amazing. The feeling of being in a room with a bunch of other people holding hands to music at that point, it was, I don't know, it was effervescent. It was uncanny how powerful that felt. You'd see people take breaks and have tears in their eyes, right? Because we were back doing this thing after more than a year, and after all the uncertainty and all the loss. In Monterey, the president of the Dance Association passed from COVID-19. And so this is something that really impacted the community and that they wanted to take seriously. The other thing that happened is, what happens now? Hayward is no longer masks and vaccine mandates. How do you transition away from that? Some places just got frustrated. We can't book bands if we make them wear masks. So they sort of threw up their hands and said, no more mandates. Other places did surveys and really worked with the community to figure out where the community, where the comfort level for the community was, but it's still choice making, right? Whose well-being are you prioritizing? Are you prioritizing the immunocompromised? Are you prioritizing the people who can't wear masks for whatever reason, right? You have to make choices about who's centered in this conversation. And some dance organizations were more purposeful than others in that. And I guess we'll take that moment to go to my last content-bearing slide, which is thinking about managing change and cultural sustainability more broadly. Hood Skippers is an ethnomusicologist who asks sort of why some musical practices survive and others don't. And he has a lovely web of different material conditions that can bring about sustainability and survivability for musical practices. And Confidence scores pretty well on his metrics. And part of that is because they've been adaptable through a lot of things. One of the things that's going on right now is a generation shift, right? I have people talking about what it's like to try and take over for, frankly, the boomer generation who has been in charge of this since the mid-20th century. And it's a tough change because some of these norms are very different across generations at the same time that this community values intergenerational practice, right? As I said, 8-year-olds and octogenarians should be dancing together by the sort of framework of this practice. And so how do you keep that up? Really, one of the big questions is whose dance experience is centered? When I first began dancing in 2008 here in the Bay Area, these dance weekends were only letting the same number of women register as men so that men would be guaranteed to have a woman to dance with. That shocked me in 2008 in, you know, one of the larger, more queer communities of, I don't know, the world. But still, the idea that women would want to dance together and that would be okay. When I would dance with women, I would be accused of taking people's partners. And so that tells you who, at least when I came into this community, who was centered, right? Whose experience was the most valued. And very quickly that started being questioned. The other thing that happened is in the 70s, right? When the MIT and Harvard folks came over and founded their dances in the San Francisco Bay Area, you also saw the rise of gay and lesbian contra dances, separate dances for the queer community to dance together. And that is because at the time in mainstream dances, you would get comments if you wanted to dance with people of the same gender, or if you had uncertain gender presentation, right? There was a lot of micro and macro aggressions toward the queer community. One of the interesting things starting in about 2016 was the discussion about how to take gender away from this dance practice, because in addition to the trans community, the non-binary members of our community really don't feel comfortable being called either a gent or a lady. And I certainly didn't like being called a man while I was dancing in the left hand. And so there's been a system of degendering the dance roles and also decentering heterosexual courtship as a main metaphor for the dancing couple, right? This is something callers would do a lot, is they'd sort of use sort of flirtatious or romantic frameworks for what's going on with a dancing couple, right? If you've been dancing anywhere, this is somewhat normal, but it was really clear that the younger generation did not want courtship on the dance floor. People still find boyfriends and girlfriends and special friends, and you hear all about contra dance marriages that last for decades, and it's sort of a piece of the community, but they don't want it to be part of the rhetoric of the dance floor. All right, and so I'll just end with a quote from guitarist Ezra Dane Lansman, who said, in reaction, I guess the thing that I want you to know is these changes have been made on the coast, and there was a big kerfuffle before the pandemic. After the pandemic, this is now just the norm. And people largely are uncommented on it. We teach beginners as larks and robins instead of gents and ladies, and none of the dances in the Bay Area have come back with gendered role terms. And it just is. The other thing that hasn't come back is queer contra on the coasts. There are no longer segregated queer contra dances. And at least according to Ezra Jane and a number of my other interlocutors, by and large, as a queer and trans person, I'm getting all my needs and my requirements met in that mainstream space. So to me personally, it wouldn't be worth my time to make an explicitly, exclusively queer space. And so there we go, adaptability. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. Good luck. last thing I want to do is say that I also lead a barn dance, which is slightly simpler choreography. The quarterly barn dance in the hay barn is on November 24th at 3:30. Bill Coulter is leading the Celtic Music Ensemble for live music. Come and dance with us if you'd like. We would love it if you'd join us. All right.
Great, thank you. And as I promised, there is time for what?
Could you elaborate on the Uzbekistan connection?
No, sure. Well, I wrote my first book on women musicians in Uzbekistan. I did my original dissertation research in Uzbekistan. I play an instrument called the dutar. And there is another ethnomusicologist, Theodore Levin, who teaches out of Dartmouth. Or I think he is also emeritus. But he played in Dudley Loftman's Canterbury Country Dance Band in the 70s. And he is the other main scholar who works on Uzbek music in my field. And so for some reason, Central Asianists and contra dance music all go together.
Can the contra dancing spread there?
It has not. I would love to, man, if I could convince the US Embassy to invite me to call contra dance in Tashkent, I would 100% do it. We'd have to find a fiddler who could hack it though. Yeah.
Well, something for me. My vision of contra dance, ignorant, came from going to, Renaissance fairs, with fairs spelled with a final E, that kind of thing. And there would be people in faux peasant outfits, like later Hosen, British, stomping and hitting the ground with sticks. That's what I remember. Now, that was contra dancing. It wasn't partnered, it was.
I think you're talking about Morris dancing, but it's within,
You're absolutely right.
it's within the framework of country dancing. And you do see there, one of the things that I didn't spend time talking about is the overlap of these dance communities. And so there are a lot of Morris dancers who also do contra dance, who also do English country dancing, which is very popular at Renaissance fairs because you wear the peasant blouses and all the things. And you do English country dancing, which is a little bit more, it has a more dedicated relationship to the past in terms of these older chestnut dances where you have choreography and music going together. And so English country dancing, Morris dancing, contra dancing have really, the Venn diagram would have a very wide center in there of dancers who do those.
But I get what was revelatory for me in this was that contra dancing is not primarily a sort of retro folklorico kind of operation, but it's really a living tradition that has roots in past roots, but it's actually inventing. And that was great.
Yeah, no, it is definitely active. It has a relationship with the past, but it's very much alive and adapting.
The parts about technology and the parts about gender were very interesting as you think about adaptations, as you say. Could you talk a bit about what kinds of demographics are attracted to this? Because you said nothing about racial or national descent.
Could you just repeat the question?
Sure. The question is about demographics. And yes, I actually deleted my demographics slide 4 times. So thank you for asking me this question. Yes, contra dancing, in case you can't tell from the video, is overly largely white, and especially in certain places. And it is interesting, there was some interest in conjunction with the George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matter movement. There were a number of contra dance groups that started anti-racist book clubs as part of their dance communities. And they would meet in the dance hall and they would read Ibrahim Kendi's book and Ta-Nehisi Coates. And there was a commitment to it. I think there is the fact that this is a colonial practice. And so people who have a relationship to a colonial past are the ones who may be attracted to this, as well as during the bicentennial celebrations in the mid-70s. This was one of these places where contra dance came back up. The other thing is the demographics skew high educated, right? And that's because of its connection to colleges, among other things. And it's a friendly place for geeks. So again, all of these things are suggesting that a high level of education is sort of, it's not, there are plenty of people of all education levels who come in and do it, but the people who are most central to the community tend to be of the higher education bracket. And so, yeah, this is a question of how one becomes inclusive, and it's something they're doing some purposeful work on. The San Francisco dance that I called yesterday is in a new venue, and one of the things that they talk about being more inclusive across economic brackets as well as across racial brackets is proximity to transport, proximity to public transport. And so this new hall is on the BART line and on the Muni line, and it stays open late enough that people can, or they stop the dance before the last trains. And so this is an attempt to try and do this. It isn't terribly effective, and I think it is also okay to acknowledge this is a colonial practice. It has its roots in the British Isles. People with heritage ties to those communities are often attracted to this. We look at heritage music practices across the world. This is a heritage music practice that has ties to the British Isles, but it is a community that is committed to inclusivity. So this is certainly a growth area. You can see how effective their inclusivity projects around gender and sexuality have been. Their inclusivity projects around race have been less successful. I was the one who suggested, we have an amazing mariachi group here at UCSC, and I remember suggesting hey, dance organizers, if you're looking for bands, what about our son bands? What about these? And I got a lot of pushback. And it was interesting to me that they really wanted they were like, oh, what if, I'm like, I'm sure a son band can play square tunes. They can find the right tunes. But there was a pushback. They wanted this sort of pretty white, it's okay if it's influenced by, jazz and all these other things, but they didn't want a jazz band. They didn't want a mariachi band. And so I think musical choices also influence. And it's also pretty square choreography. I think it is fair to say that it's pretty rigid white folks dancing, and that's other people might not be so interested in it. But that said, I want to say one more thing, which is barn dances, which tend to skew more toward beginners, do tend to have a more racially and ethnically diverse demographic.
But what do the Caribbean versions look like?
They look very different, and they are very influenced by Afro-Caribbean music and dance practices, and they are certainly practiced by. But I look at that choreography and I would need to study. I can't go walk into a contra dance in Haiti and be able to function. I would need to scale up. So they look different. It's a different community, right? Different social location, different needs.
So we have 2 more questions, Kathy, and then.
Yeah.
I was going to ask about choreography. You can certainly hear the difference from different things. And it's, I remember dance, contra dancing in New England, Western Massachusetts all the time in the 1970s. So to hear that and see it as contra dance is very interesting. You showed us the improvisation thing for the high-level dancers, but I wondered to what extent new figures and choreographies were being brought in by the callers and these dance weekend gatherings that then filtered down to everyone.
Sure. A lot of local callers. This is the other thing that perhaps I should have said clearly, which is musicians and callers also dance. Everyone who is part of this community generally, who is able-bodied enough, can dance in this. So a lot of callers use dance weekends as a place to find new choreography sets, but you have to make sure it fits your community, right? You can find the coolest thing where they're doing whatever zigzag zucchini move, but if your dancers aren't ready to do that, then you don't want to force them into it and make everybody miserable, because the function is to facilitate joyful movement, not to make somebody do a zigzag zucchini, right? And so there's that. The other thing is people get moves from English country dance, there are different moves, the right shoulder round came in from, and the dolphin hay came in from English country dance. So related dance forms, people will borrow moves. And it has changed over time. In the 70s, there was a lot less of both couples within a group of 4 being active at the same time. And sometimes current, what is often called modern urban contra dance, is criticized for being overly aerobic and overly active and taking the social out of the social dance form, because you're not standing around having a chance to talk to whoever your partner is very often. You're moving all the time. So that's sort of my 2-minute history of contra dance choreography.
I believe I used to
dance over at Portuguese Hall, country western dancing,
Oh, nice.
line dancing. And there's seems like a lot of similarities, but also some differences. Can you share comments on the relationship?
I can say that as a color, a lot of people think they're coming to a line dance, a country line dance where they're gonna do the boot scoot boogie and the electric slide when they show up. And so sometimes there's a little bit of an adjustment when someone shows up brand new. Yeah, certainly it's related in that it's a European derived Western sort of collective dance practice. In line dancing, you don't usually have a partner unless they do a two-step at some point. And the choreographies are a little more sort of, they aren't as connected to the music necessarily. Although now I take that back, the electric slide is really like it's written for line dancing. So when you have tunes that are written for Western line dancing, that is certainly a connection. But I don't know, it's a different dance population too. That interestingly, those don't cross-populate as much as blues and swing. There are lots of swing dancers, blues dancers, Morris dancers, English country dancers who also do contra. Line dancing seems to be a different population, and I don't know
Well,
why.
it's feeding off of the country western songs.
Yeah,
And I think a lot of the dances derive from the song. They become associated with
Yeah.
specific songs.
and it's certainly a different genre of music, right? The roots of the music that gets played for contra dances comes from Irish music, old time, New England fiddle tunes. So, which is sort of adjacent to country, but not quite in the same place. So, yeah, it may be that.
So one more question.
Yeah, so, back in the day being the seventies and eighties, we used to be friends with some people who were into Morris dancing.
Okay.
And they would do Morris dancing on particular moments such as, I think it's the 21st of December when the light changes.
The solstice. Yep.
And they were rather geeky, and we got to talking, and I am in fact a North African historian. And so I persuaded them that actually Morris dancing is actually Moorish dancing. And in fact, it's a whole, if you start looking this up systematically, that there was we think of Islam and Christianity as being impenetrable back in the Middle Ages. And there
No,
was
I don't think that, but okay.
a lot of movement back and forth with people.
Oh, yes.
And Moorish dancing came from Moorish performers who would go through England, among other places. And so, I mean, so if you want to put in a little decolonization note, here's a place to start.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I agree. Things are always a little more connected than the rigid stories we like to tell about them. I will take that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tanya.
And I'm serious, come dance in the hay barn on the 24th. We would love to have you.
Yeah.